Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Tyler and the focus is Whig VP. The year is 1837. Tyler has just resigned as a member of the United States Senate over a conflict he had with the Virginia state legislature. Decided to sell the family home, move back to Williamsburg, Virginia, near his alma mater, William and Mary. He'd been away from his kids throughout much of their upbringing because he was off in his various political roles. He thought it was an opportunity, a pause in his political career, reconnect with the family, focus on his farm, maybe restart his law practice. But he did make a conscious decision around his political future as well, in that he left the Democratic Party. He was disgusted with Andrew Jackson, all the conflicts that he had when he was in the Senate, and Jackson was doing all this overreach of his authority, sort of a monarchical reign as President of the United States. This was not for John Tyler, so he left the party. Where to go? Well, the two-party system in the United States had come along before the turn of the century, and it existed for a couple of decades before it kind of went away in the 1820s. Well, now it was definitely back. You had Jacksonians, Democrats on the one side, and now you have Henry Clay's Whigs as the opposition party. Now, mostly what they were for was they were against anything to do with Andrew Jackson and his followers. But they did rally around Clay's American system, which had public policy in mind, an active role of the federal government in the lives of the American citizenry, using protective tariffs as a means to help nascent industries in the United States grow in the international trade business. Also, they were against things like federally funded internal improvements. They were for the Bank of the United States. They were for the distribution of funds from the sale of public lands back to the states. These are what they were for, all of which was anathema to John Tyler. He was ideologically disaligned with almost every one of these policy areas. Nevertheless, couldn't be a Jacksonian Democrat anymore. He'd been a longtime friend of Henry Clay on a personal level. This was really the only alternative, so he decided to become a Whig. And the Whigs quickly embraced him. The Whigs ran their first candidates for president in 1836, and they couldn't really come together on a single candidate. So there were actually four leading candidates who made the race against the handpicked successor of Andrew Jackson, which was Martin Van Buren, the incumbent vice president. So you've got these four Whigs running against Van Buren in 1836. Van Buren went to an easy victory, mainly because the country was still enamored largely with Jackson, and Van Buren had committed to continuing the Jackson policies. Where did John Tyler fit in this mix? Well, he was put forward by some Whigs as a vice presidential candidate and actually got 47 votes in the Electoral College for vice president for the former Democrat, now Whig, maybe a harbinger for things to come. Well, Tyler actually was elected president of something at the time. It was called the Virginia Colonization Society, a forerunner to the American Colonization Society. James Madison, James Monroe, former presidents, Tyler, among many others who were feeling that at some point, blacks and whites, free blacks and whites, the question was, could they live together in the long term? And many thought the answer was simply no. And the right answer was to find another place for blacks to go, particularly focused on West Africa. Liberia, for example. In fact, its new capital was named Monrovia after James Monroe. And Tyler was among those who thought this was going to be a good answer for freed blacks in North America. Couldn't live together with whites effectively, so let's transport them to West Africa. In fact, Tyler said Monrovia will be to Africa what Jamestown and Plymouth have been to America. Well, of course, he was completely wrong. Despite some very high important people being behind these movements, very, very little actually came of it. Well, he was back in office pretty soon, John Tyler. He wasn't away from politics for very long. The citizens of Williamsburg decided to place him back in the House of Delegates. He agreed to serve. He became Speaker of the House. In fact, this was in 1838. The next year, he was in line to go back to the United States Senate, which Tyler actually very much wanted to do, but there was still conflict over his candidacy and a couple of others. So after a whole bunch of votes, the state legislature deadlocked, and that seat actually remained vacant for quite some time. Well, we're now at the national level, 1839, December, and the Whigs are coming together in convention in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to pick its VP or president and VP candidates to try to take on the incumbent Van Buren. Van Buren's role as president of the United States, his administration was not very effective. The country had been in a panic since 1837 when he took over, mostly because Van Buren was so committed to Jackson's economic policies, which were frankly largely a disaster for the Van Buren administration. So things were not looking very good for Van Buren, and possibly the Whigs could get their first man as president. Henry Clay, the essential founder of the party, really wanted that job, but the delegates in Harrisburg weren't convinced he was the right choice. They were wary of him. He had run before and lost. He was pretty controversial. So even though he led on the first ballot, on the fifth ballot, William Henry Harrison was actually nominated for the presidency. Now, Harrison was the former governor of the Indiana Territory and had been a major general for the United States in the war against the British and the Indians in the War of 1812. He was the hero of battles of Tippecanoe, which was one of the battles against the Indians, also the hero of the Battle of the Thames. So the war hero was ready to run as the standard bearer for the Whigs. What about the VP? Well, offers were made to a couple of sitting U.S. senators who declined the opportunity, and the delegates really wanted somebody from the South. Now, Harrison and Tyler actually came originally from the same county in Virginia. They were both products of the Virginia elites, and both were pro-slavery. But Harrison had moved in his teenage years to the Northwest Territory and had lived pretty much most of his adult life in the North, and so the Southerners wanted a Southerner on the ticket to make sure somebody was representing their interests regarding slavery. John Tyler perhaps fit that bill. In fact, when his nomination went forward, he was nominated and approved in a unanimous fashion, although with one interesting caveat. His home state of Virginia did not vote. They withheld all of their votes. So there were no nay votes for Tyler, but for some reason, never really explained, his home state did not vote in his favor. Nevertheless, you now have the ticket of William Henry Harrison and John Tyler in a presidential campaign, the likes of which the country had never seen. And it started really with a notice in the Baltimore Republican newspaper right after Harrison got the nomination. It sort of derisively said about Harrison, "Give him a barrel of hard cider and a pension of $2,000 a year, and our word for it, he will sit the remainder of his days in a log cabin by the side of a sea coal fire and study moral philosophy." This was definitely intended as an insult, but the masses embraced that insult. They thought, this is our common man. We don't want an elitist like Martin Van Buren was portrayed in running against Harrison. We want the common man of the log cabin and the hard cider, and that campaign began, and log cabins started popping up across the country for rallies, serving, of course, hard cider. There were banners and posters and books and songs. There were scores of songs written in favor of the ticket of Harrison and Tyler against Van Buren, and most of these were about Harrison. But there were some that included Tyler as well, including one comment from a newspaper editor at the time: if a Democrat tried to speak, argue, or answer anything that was said or done, he was only saluted with a fresh deluge of music. If a Democrat would say that John Tyler was no Whig, the Whigs would join in a derisive laugh at a song which ended with the chorus, "And will vote for Tyler, therefore, without a why or wherefore." Well, they would come to regret that notion, but that was part of the themes of this propaganda campaign for Harrison and Tyler. Then they got a slogan. This one started with a pickpocket who was being taken to jail in Richmond, Virginia. But there was a political rally going on at the time for the Harrison and Tyler ticket. And he said, "Give me a moment. I want to be able to go over there and give my support to Tippecanoe and Tyler too." And that theme stuck. The Tippecanoe and Tyler too campaign became part of this hard cider and log cabin campaign, this grassroots in favor of the Whig candidates. It was certainly interesting that much of this was misleading. Again, Tyler and Harrison were not the common man of the log cabin. They were both political elites originally from the storied families of Virginia. Harrison lived in a log house in Ohio, but it was more of a log mansion. It had 16 rooms to it, and he had actually sworn off alcohol because of alcoholism and how it had affected one of his children. So he was hardly this log cabin and hard cider candidate. Nevertheless, The propaganda was working, and he let it continue. But actually, the more dishonest part of the campaign was John Tyler running as a Whig. No one seemed to notice or care that the vice president candidate for the Whigs had a history of opposing almost everything that they stood for. A man in Virginia by the name of John Winston made this point. Tip, talking about Tippecanoe Harrison. Tip was bank, Ty was anti-bank. Tip was tariff, Ty was anti-tariff. Tip was distribution, Ty was anti. In fact, fellow citizens, Tip is a Whig, Ty is a Democrat. And that was essentially true, but no one seemed to care. The vice president really never mattered that much at the time. No president had died to date, and even vice presidents who served really were not part of the administration. Van Buren was when he was the VP to Jackson. But other than that, vice presidents did their role as the president of the Senate, where they would preside and vote to break ties. That was it. They were much more the legislative branch, even that relatively minor role, than they were in the executive branch. And so they were barely an afterthought, even though, of course, if something happened to the president, then the vice president would take over. Nobody seemed to mind or care that Tyler was against many of the things that the Whigs stood for. In fact, Tyler was asked the question, didn't somebody talk to you about this? And his answer was, I was wholly unquestioned about my opinions and was selected, as I firmly believe, because of my uniform opposition to a broad construction of the Constitution and my known advocacy of the principles of a good old honest Republican Party. Maybe not, and certainly that would not play out well when he becomes president of the United States. Well, Tyler mostly stayed quiet during the campaign. He did make one speaking appearance at the Whig convention in Ohio in late September, and a couple of other speaking moments sort of associated with that trip, but he was mostly circumspect. He stayed away from any controversial topic, like what his real political beliefs were, mostly stayed out of the mix as the masses were rallying around Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Well, the masses showed up. 80% of the population, of the voting eligible population, turned out to vote in the 1840 election. In fact, 2.5 million people almost showed up to the polls, about 60% more than the previous election. Is this concept of democracy expanding, not only based on number of new states that were bringing in eligible voters, but also the franchise being extended to more white males as part of the population. And this was an overwhelming victory for the Whigs. Harrison and Tyler beat Van Buren in the Electoral College by a vote of 234 to 60. Harrison came to Virginia just before the inauguration to actually work on his inaugural address, think about his cabinet, and he hooked up with Tyler on the ride to Washington, D.C., where they joined together March 4th of 1840 in a frigidly cold day in Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. There were about 50,000 people on hand. As soon as the inauguration was done, as vice president, Tyler was the president of the Senate, so he convened the Senate, got the nominations for Harrison's cabinet in place. They were all confirmed, and Tyler went home to Williamsburg, Virginia. He wasn't there very long. His time away from Washington was much shorter than he was originally planned. He was back in D.C. in just about a month with a whole new job, but that is the story for another day. That is John Tyler and Whig VP from the life of John Tyler. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.